Hello everyone, this is part 14 of What If Naruto Was a Puppeteer, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Naruto wasn't surprised when the dust settled and there wasn't so much as a scratch on Sasori. A thin dome of iron sand covered him, glowing a dull red in parts from the intense heat of the blasts. It fell away, pulling around the third Kazekage. The human puppet was draped over Sasori's shoulders as an extra, unneeded layer of defense. I wanted to thank you for being so predictable, Naruto called out with a grin. When I realized the Akatsuki were behind this escalation in the war, I never thought I'd be able to separate one of you from the group. You guys travel in pairs, right? Sasori said nothing, simply dusting his cloak off disdainfully as the Kazekage hovered back a few paces. But I knew you would be different, the blonde continued, subtly shuffling back himself until his foot met resistance. Of course you'd think you could handle me all by yourself. You've done it before, right? Your miraculous survival has gone to your head if you think anything will be different this time, Sasori replied calmly, flexing his hands. Naruto's expression darkened as he tested the wire he had hidden beneath the leaves earlier. Oh, things will be very different this time. Naruto's hands shot up like whips, and despite all of his training and progress, Sasori was still faster. The Kazekage reared back, a compartment on his chest opening up and releasing a broad pulse of chakra. The hovering iron filings behind Sasori twitched, before forming into 1,000 tiny senbon. The rocketed forward, propelled faster than any hand could throw by the pure magnetic force generated from the dead man's Kekkei Genkai. But Naruto wasn't going for a puppet. His hands flashed through well-practiced hand signs, ending on the dragon's seal. Raiten, Jaibushi, he called, slamming his hands down on the wire hidden in the underbrush. A low hum filled the air as the camouflage protecting his homemade electromagnets burned away under the sudden heat in the copper wires. 4 of them, hidden at the cardinal points around the decoy campsite. After their ill-fated first meeting, Naruto had spent many sleepless nights racking his brain for a way to overcome the Kazekage's famous Jitan abilities. The answer had come, of all places, from the weak little magnet that kept his fridge closed. He didn't have to beat the Kazekage's magnetism, just overpower it. Sure enough, with the current provided by his jutsu running through the copper coils, the large iron cores he had hidden behind camouflaged sheets became extremely powerful magnets almost instantaneously. The iron sand that had been racing towards him abruptly veered off, congealing around the electromagnets in strange, lumpy spikes that twitched as Sasori tried to press his control. It was too late for that though. The moment the human puppet was vulnerable, Naruto's other arm flashed out, fingers dancing. 5 copies of Dami burst from the earth, like zombies clawing their way from the grave. All of them rushed the Kazekage, all of them inscribed with enough explosive seals to level small buildings. Naruto wasn't playing around in this game. Sasori scowled, still wrestling with the iron sand. Something thin and fast whipped out of his cloak, a dark gray streak, shining with poison. It would have cleaved right through all 5 puppets, if Naruto hadn't chosen that moment to cut off the chakra to his jutsu. It was slight, a mere stumble, but the sudden lack of magnetic force unbalanced the red-haired puppeteer just slightly. Naruto wasn't unaffected himself, but his weapon wasn't a part of his body. 3 of the Damis were bisected cleanly by whatever weapon Sasori had engineered into his immortal husk. 2 of them made it. The explosion rivaled the first, and this time Sasori was forced to leap away, suffering from the lack of the iron sand's protection. The Kazekage was nothing but splinters when Naruto finally lowered his hand from his eyes, grinning wickedly. I think that brings the count of puppets I've cost you up to 2, he called out. It was hard to imagine Sasori having a more powerful puppet on hand than a former Kage. So, unless he was hiding the Sandime Raikage in those cloud-patterned robes, he felt he could handle whatever the puppeteer could throw at him from here. Sasori wasn't even frowning when he re-emerged. Your body will replace them, soon enough. His own expression turned into a cold smirk. I've never had a Jinchuriki in my collection before. Naruto tried not to let the older puppeteer's self-assurance get to him, but found his hands flexing in agitation despite himself. He had to constantly remind himself that he had been preparing for this for months. Projecting confidence was the best way to feel it. I prefer to think of it as a service, Naruto shot back, still giving a grin he far from felt. If I kill you, it saves you the pain of the QB absolutely annihilating you. He had no idea if that was how it worked, or if the QB would even be released upon his death, but it at least seemed to give Sasori pause. I'd like to see you make a puppet from an immortal mass of chakra and hate. A shame, the man muttered, drawing a thin scroll from his back. Without that you will hold nothing of interest to me, save as another body for the Legion. Lifeless eyes narrowed slightly as wooden lips quirked. I should introduce you to your future comrades. You should feel honored, for you will soon join a technique that has conquered a nation. With a flourish, the surprisingly long scroll spread out around Sasori like a bodhisattva's 10, revealing hundreds of tiny storage seals intricately woven into a single matrix. Sasori made a single ram seal and smiled wickedly. Akahigi, Hyaki no Soen. Puppets blotted out the stars. 100 of them, floating in the skies above them like an ominous shroud. The sound of their joints clacking and shaking formed a low background noise that completely enveloped the natural sounds of the night. Sasori shed the upper half of his cloak, further revealing the perversions he had forced his body through, including a grotesque fleshy circle where his heart should have been, and a slightly raised hatch on the other side of his chest. It opened, releasing countless chakra strings that sought out each and every puppet in the sky, and the malicious gleam in the puppeteer's glassy eyes told Naruto that he could control every single one. Well shit, Naruto muttered, taking an instinctual step back against the sheer scale of the clicking, rattling cloud of deaths. He rallied himself with a deep breath and forced the cocky grin back onto his features, noticeably more strained. Well now I'm just pissed, he said, this time loud enough to be heard. To enlighten me, Sasori drawled back, the puppets beginning to spread out in the sky. I thought I was the first one to work out how to control more than 10 puppets. He turned his hand over to reveal what looked to be little diamond tattoos on his palms. He forced chakra through them and they grew, spiraling outward in little spindly lines. The black tattoos grew all the way up his forearms, as far as he had mastered the technique so far. Eventually, he hoped the patterning would cover his entire body. The tattoos were a web, intersecting at seemingly random points across his skin, but every single crossing marked a tenketsu. Unlike an actual tattoo, they would move with his tenketsu, reliably giving their position at all times. The funny thing was that, without Hanabi and her Byakugan, this would have been almost impossible to duplicate. It allowed him to, with the right focus. Sasori watched placidly as chakra threads burst from Naruto's arms, visibly only in the fraction of a moment they left his body. He didn't spot them all, but from his own knowledge of the human body he estimated it was roughly 40, that was, if the technique was limited to the tenketsu near the teen's skin. His malicious smirk returned. I think you'll find you are still outnumbered, and outmatched. I have spent years honing my technique, it looks like you are struggling to even stand with yours. That was true enough. Naruto wasn't sure he could even move his feet when concentrating on so many disparate puppets just now emerging from the storage scrolls he had hidden all over the nearby forest. But then, what kind of puppeteer would he be if he had to move to fight? I like to think of it as quality over quantity, he shot back through gritted teeth. So, the move he had been saving in reserve as a trump card had been forced into play early, just to deal with Sasori's numbers. It was probably better this way. Imagining trying to use this technique after a long and drawn-out fight gave him phantom aches. That, or the strain of his own jutsu was making him light-headed. Soen, Mugen no Kanose, he muttered as he felt the last few strings connect with their puppets. It was like there was an entire crowd in his head, jostling for position as his mind tried to track the position of 36 different puppets. This was the most he had been able to manage so far. He had thought it would be an overwhelming advantage, not an attempt at evening the scales. I'll admit, your bag of tricks has grown deeper, but this is a stalling tactic at best. Your fate is. You know, Naruto ground out, cutting in before Sasori could continue his spiel. I did have this whole quippy thing, about the quality of a performance being measured by its ensemble. But, to be honest, this is really hard. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to get on with the whole trying to kill you bit now. Sasori clicked his fake teeth, and everything started to move. The cloud descended like a tsunami, a rolling wave of wooden bodies ready to crush Naruto beneath the sheer mass. A streak of a silhouette passed in front of him, and the frontmost puppets abruptly fell limp, clattering to the ground at his feet to be pounced upon by 5 copies of Ramia waiting beneath the earth. It circled back around again, this time catching the moonlight. At first glance it could be mistaken for an incredibly large bird, not too outlandish as summons were known to be larger. On closer inspection, the humanoid traits could be picked out, and it was revealed to be some kind of woman-bird hybrid, with large, broad wings, whose feathers seemed to intermittently catch the light in a glittering, distracting display. Each one was rimmed by the thinnest band of sharpened chakra metal, making every feather on her body a weapon waiting to be released. It was necessary to make Hain, as he had named her, combat-ready. Her flight required her to be light, so it limited the number of weapons he could install inside her body. Her body being the weapon neatly circumvented that problem. After every feather was released, a specialized storage seal would slot another in its place. His first flying puppet wouldn't run out easily, and there were currently 10 of them circling the skies. Naruto breathed deeply, taking advantage of Sasori's curiosity at the new puppet to firm up his stance. Controlling so many puppets at once made it easy to forget about his own body, and he couldn't afford to fall over and lose his line of sight. Sasori was under no such restriction, and every single chittering puppet in his horde seemed dead set on going right for the throat. A maelstrom of wood and metal engulfed him, held at bay only by the valiant efforts of his own constructs. Hain shot by, her wings deftly slicing through Sasori's chakra strings and briefly cutting off control to a swathe of the legion. 5 different water cannons were firing almost indiscriminately into the swarm. Glistening strands of quick-drying adhesive crisscrossed the clearing like an oversized parody of a real spider's web. Through it all, Sasori's puppets ducked and weaved, slowly being whittled down. It wasn't easy though. For every 2 puppets Sasori lost, one of Naruto's was brought down by a storm of blades and kunai that filled the air with the whistle and screech of metal. The blonde knew that wasn't a winning ratio and reached out with one of his spare chakra strings as another Hain was ripped out of the sky. It found one of the traps he had laid earlier and pulled, releasing the trigger on the storage seals winding up a nearby tree trunk. They released as one, spewing a wave of kunai through the night. It carved a chunk out of Sasori's legion, shattering wood and metal like shrapnel. It also caught a few of Naruto's own puppets in the confusion and, even strengthened by the chakra wires in their body acting like an artificial chakra system, they couldn't stand up to that much weaponry. At least it gave Naruto less to concentrate on, making his remaining puppets more nimble and responsive. But then, that was also true for Sasori. Ramia's tail wound around him, protecting him from a hail of poison senbon that thudded into her thick scales. He had modified this one specifically to be tougher than most, at the cost of mobility, and Sasori's attacks were still this powerful. He forced the rush of fear out and focused on the skies. His cohort of winged puppets was his least damaged and was still doing good work, sweeping in and out of the fight like sentient blades, severing Sasori's chakra strings left and right. Being introduced to that property of chakra blades was probably saving his life now. The other puppeteer, of course, could simply reattach new threads, but those precious moments where his puppets were tumbling through the air, uncontrolled, was usually the opening for his other puppets to finish him off. The man didn't leave many others. The battle was settling into a kind of frantic rhythm. Sasori knew that the Hain puppets were the biggest threat and Naruto's greatest advantage, but whenever any puppets peeled away from the Legion to go after them, they would be torn down by the tight jets of a water cannon, or pounced upon by an Arakun waiting in the shadows. Naruto felt the first stirrings of a grin begin to spread across his face. He could do this. He was doing this. Then one of Sasori's puppets managed to break through his ring of defense and promptly exploded, throwing the teen across the clearing. He managed to roll to his feet, but he was disoriented and his head was ringing from the blast. That few seconds lapse in control nearly cost him immensely as the bulk of the puppet horde turned upward, charging the suddenly vulnerable Hain copies. Thanks to his wobbling vision and the tinny ring in his ears, Naruto almost didn't capitalize on the move he had been waiting for the whole fight. Almost too late, he sent a pulse of chakra through his strings and all of the remaining Hain puppets shot upwards with a powerful beat of their wings. They were nothing but streaks of light for a moment, leaving strange, inverted vapor trails through the late-night mists, before reaching the zenith of their flight. Sasori realized his mistake too late as his puppets tried to turn and descend again. The Hain puppets curled up into little bristling balls before exploding outwards, releasing their entire payload of weaponized feathers at once. For a moment they seemed to hang in their air, 1,000 glittering shards of shrapnel, gleaming with condensation. Then, With a muted swish of air being parted, what looked to be Sasori's entire horde suddenly went limp, their strings severed indiscriminately. Both puppeteers went into a frenzy. Sasori's chest compartment released another salvo of his chakra strings, desperately trying to reassert control over his army. Naruto's arms moved like a panicking conductor, directing his own puppets to slash and tear and break whatever they could in those precious few moments of complete control. Sasori's puppets, when once again under his control, gave as good as they got, often exploding when too badly damaged. Still, it was a pivotal moment in the fight, and, after a handful of seconds that seemed stretched out between a dozen different perspectives, the clearing fell quiet again. Naruto was panting heavily, surrounded by a sea of broken wood and twisted metal. But he had won. Sasori's entire legion lay in tatters around them, mostly useless. He hadn't fared too much better, only a single Hane and the listing Ramia wrapped around his body surviving the pitched slaughter, but that was 2 more puppets than Sasori. And that could be all the difference. Hey, he panted, taking a moment to calm his breathing as he just enjoyed the sight of Sasori's narrowed eyes. What did I say, about quality, over quantity? I admit, Sasori responded tersely, that I never imagined you improving this much. But you'll find this is far from over. As he spoke, he shucked the rest of his cloak, casually tossing it to the side to reveal the full extent of his body modification. Some kind of prehensile cable was spooled in his abdomen like metal intestines, and 2 metal wings unfurled from his back, flexing experimentally. It looked like they could rotate completely, either lifting the puppeteer into their air, or turning into wicked buzzsaws at a moment's notice. It has been a long time, since I have been forced to use myself. His hands snapped up mechanically, a tube emerging from each palm. Naruto didn't have to know what they did to know it was a bad idea to be in their path and swiftly dove out of the way. He was thankful for it. 2 brilliant streams of fire erupted from the other puppeteer's hands. The heat was incredible, instantly burning off the mist in the area and leaving the ground dry and cracking. Naruto dived behind a heaped pile of broken puppets, not even remotely trusting Ramia to hold up against that kind of inferno. Sasori simply moved his arms, almost lazily, and put the haphazard ridge of broken parts to the torch. That many puppets, at that distance, they weren't instantly incinerated, but Naruto was already moving. He threw out a hand, latching onto one of Sasori's less damaged wrecks and forced it to leap in the opposite direction, briefly distracting his opponent. He sprinted out of the other side, Ramia keeping pace. Her tail flicked up, and he poured as much chakra into her water cannon as he thought was safe, then a bit more for good measure. The 2 opposing streams met and an awful hissing filled the clearing as the tight beam of water was instantly reduced to scalding steam. Still, it held. At least, it did, until Sasori's hands rotated 360 degrees, tightening the gouts of fire into coin-thin jets of pure white heat. Ramia throwing herself forward was all that stopped Naruto from instantly being reduced to a pile of ash. It seemed some kind of kami was watching him as, a moment later, the streams of fire sputtered out, their fuel depleted. Some kind of thin scroll on Sasori's back glowed, before fading away. There was a brief disconnect between Naruto's body and mind. His mind was trying to pick apart how Sasori could produce such concentrated flame and how the scroll system worked. His body, on the other hand, had turned and sprinted towards the tree line, acting on a much more ingrained set of instincts. You seem fond of your water cannons, Sasori remarked with a cruel smile, one of the other scrolls pulsing with chakra. Let me show you how powerful they can really be. Some powerful water ninjutsu Naruto had seen wouldn't have compared to the jets Sasori released. The ground, glowing faintly and cracked from the previous heat, exploded where he aimed from the sudden change in temperature. The floor was turned into an impromptu minefield as Naruto ducked and weaved, only making it to the tree line by the skin of his teeth. Although, he wasn't much safer there. One of the water jets hit a tree and nearly uprooted it on the spot, forcing Naruto to dive out of the way and retreat further into the forest. Find all the cover you like, Sasori called out with a manic grin. It won't help. His hands rotated, and once again the streams were concentrated to barely a ryo's width. He swept his arms out in lazy arcs before cutting off the flow. A strange silence settled on the area before it was replaced by the tortured groans of 200 trees suddenly severed clean through the trunk. The entire forest seemed to fall apart, or at least, that was how it seemed to Naruto as he scrabbled and dodged through a dozen different tree trunks trying to crush him. His only respite was that they were the sickly, thin trunks of Mizu. If this was Fire Country, he would have been crushed by his homeland's sturdy boughs by now. When the dust settled, it was like an entire logging camp had been through the area, and Naruto was left like a bright blonde beacon in the middle of it all. Sasori gave him a smirk and lifted his arm. It's been an amusing performance, but you've wasted enough of my tea. The jet of water missed Naruto by an inch, thrown upward along with Sasori's arm as Hain descended on his back, clawing and scratching with wicked talons of chakra metal. The beam flew upwards, powerful enough to cleanly part a cloud that was drifting by. Naruto had no illusions that he would have survived that, but put his near death out of mind as he focused entirely on Hain. With her artificial chakra system, and his undivided attention, he might as well have been that puppet. His control was so absolute. She moved with the fluid grace of the living, effortlessly weaving around Sasori's redirected jets with a poise and speed Naruto couldn't have managed with his own body. Wings moved in mesmerizing displays of glittering metal and polished wood, fine enough to mimic the real thing. Every time the puppeteer thought he had a bead on her, a powerful beat of her wings would abruptly jink her in the opposite direction, always skirting destruction by a few inches. She was magnificence in motion, and if Naruto hadn't trained with her extensively in the month leading up to this moment, he might have been too distracted to reach within himself and begin going through the laborious process of molding chakra without hand seals. She took a few knocks when Sasori's tight beams of liquid death grazed her skin, but she survived, and survived beautifully. It was just long enough that Naruto was able to finish. Hain's wing swept out, bringing her to an abrupt stop that would have given a real bird whiplash. Sasori's arm went out too far, caught off guard by the sudden halt, and that opening was all Naruto needed. Kaiten, Gokakyu no Jutsu, he muttered, and Hain obeyed. Her mouth opened and a brilliant ball of fire erupted from it, with no visible means of propulsion. Sasori was no stranger to the concept of puppets performing jutsu. But that was his human puppets, people whose chakra systems he had bastardized and repurposed to his own ends. The thought of an artificial puppet molding chakra was just surprising enough that, instead of diving out of the way of the jutsu like he might have in the face of a human opponent, he instead tried to bring his arm around to slice the fireball in half with his water beam. He did so, and it did nothing. This was no ignited aerosol accelerant, easily quenched. This was a chakra-based fire, and it spat on the laws of conventional physics. The beam of water neatly sliced through the fireball, and it rushed on regardless, engulfing the puppeteer's body in the next second before erupting in a grand explosion that forced Naruto to cover his eyes. It had never done that in training. He picked his way through the graveyard of wooden limbs slowly, rubbing his arm where a falling tree had glanced off him. Even now, in the quiet of the after-battle, he was trying to settle his breathing. The exertion of his Mugen no Kanose was immense, and he would have itchy red marks on his skin for the next few days. He never lowered his guard though, especially when Sasori came into view. It was an almost pitiable sight. Everything below the man's chest had been blown away, along with both arms. He was nothing but half a torso and a head, his remaining skin blackened and cracked from the heat. Curiously, the man's hair had survived just fine, only looking a bit messier for the experience. Probably artificial then. Sasori truly had no nostalgia for his living self, fully committing to this lifeless, wooden existence. That was quite good, the husk of a man stated, mouth pushed up into a grin less by his own volition than by the broken mechanism supporting his jaw. To bring something constructed of your own hands so close to life, it's an admirable interpretation of art. And a few months ago, that praise alone would have made my year, Naruto responded tiredly, still on guard for a trick. I would argue that my preservation of true ageless beauty is a more worthy pursuit, but it appears I no longer have a leg to stand on. Naruto blinked, and might have thought Sasori had rattled his brain in the blast, if the man still had a brain. The older puppeteer didn't look all that pleased himself. And now I'm making jokes. That fool Deidara is infecting me with his idiocy. That would be Deidara, the former Bakua Butai member turned nuke nin. It was always useful to know who else was in the Akatsuki. He had a growing list, and another filled with speculation. There were only so many S-class criminals on the continent, but it was nice to have confirmation. Is that really why you set this trap? Just for information. The former Sunanin let his head fall back, or maybe the support finally gave a slight smile. I approve. So, you would be willing to tell me about the Akatsuki, just like that? Naruto asked skeptically. Why not? I owe no allegiance to that group of criminals. I only joined because the offer to be surrounded by so many fascinating specimens was too tempting. He sneered, one of the few expressions he could apparently still manage. My vast network of informants was wasted on the banal plan anyway. He turned an eye back to the blonde. And any secrets I reveal are irrelevant as soon as Pain decides you are too much of a nuisance. I'll start with a list of the current members, then we can talk about this plan, Naruto said, keeping his face straight. When interrogating, it was never a good idea to let the subject know which pieces of information interested you. Kakazu of Takagakure, Hidden of Yugakure, Hoshigaki Kisame, Uchiha Itachi, some kind of plant creature simply known as Zetsu, a moron called Toby, Deodara of Iwagakure, myself, and the rulers of Omegakure, Tenshi, and Pain. Sasori listed off clinically. Sanshou no Hanzo is leader of Omegakure, Naruto counted with narrowed eyes. Everyone knew that. The man who named the Sannin wouldn't be taken down without the entire world knowing. Believe that if you must, but what reason do I have to lie now? Sasori counted. I can think of a few, Naruto muttered, before getting back on track. You still consider yourself a member of the Akatsuki then? Why wouldn't I? The man replied casually. I fully intend on returning after I've given the proper care to your corpse. The compartment on his chest suddenly sprang open, releasing a bundle of chakra strings that latched onto strategic points across Naruto's body. Soen, Hitomi Goku, he intoned with a smirk as Naruto's body froze in place. I am a puppeteer, child. The best in the world. I am not defeated as long as there is a single body to be manipulated. Naruto glared back at him furiously, but that was all he could do. The technique was clearly similar to his Jasu, although incredibly refined if it could control a human while they were awake and resisting. Against his will, his trembling hand slipped into one of his pockets, drawing a kunai and slowly raising it towards his neck. Perhaps not, Sasori mused, the glowing blue threads twitching as though played by an invisible harpist. I don't like marring the skin too much if I'm able. Don't. Naruto managed to grind out through his locked jaw. Begging for your life. I had come to expect better of you after all of this. Be pleased, I acknowledge your skill. You're certainly better than those stagnant fools in Suna, copying my designs and braying upon the past instead of innovating. Don't, Naruto repeated, straining even to say that much as the kunai moved down. A quick nick to the axillary artery perhaps. Sasori continued, ignoring him. I often find I have to completely replace the shoulder joint anyway, too restrictive. Don't, the blonde said for the third time, earning a sigh from the other puppeteer. Go on then, I find last words a waste of time, but you did provide me with many interesting ideas over the course of the fight. Naruto felt the control over his jaw cease and grinned, his eyes flashing a slitted red. Don't play with your food. Sasori cried out. His puppet body might have felt no pain, but the small organic core embedded in its chest was a different story. In a split second, the bright blue chakra threads were inverted into a flaming orange as Naruto reversed the control. The sudden influx of the Kyuubi's potent chakra proved too much and the remains of Sasori's already beaten body exploded into little more than shrapnel. Naruto nearly dropped to his knees as he felt control return to his muscles, but managed to stay upright, grimacing. He was already mentally exhausted, and tapping even that much of the Kyuubi's power was draining. He glanced around, but couldn't spot the little fleshy blob that marked Sasori's remaining humanity. Noticing that was the only warning he received. His hand flicked backwards, coiled chakra strings spiraling out. Soen, Jasu, he muttered, turning slowly. Sasori, in his commandeered puppet body, had managed to come close enough with a sword that a single drop of poison beading on its tip nearly dripped on Naruto's nose. You're not the only one who knows that trick, Naruto said, slapping an explosive tag on Sasori's extra body and jumping back. The explosion was muted, and this time, he did manage to find Sasori's core among the debris. He lifted it, mouth twisting in disgust. I can't believe I used to look up to you. He sighed, rebuffing every pathetic attempt Sasori made at latching onto something, anything, with his chakra strings. There were so many things I wanted to ask you, so many things I thought I could learn. His eyes hardened slightly as he began slowly walking towards the edge of the clearing. But, in a way, you did set me on my current path, and for that I'm thankful. He produced a small syringe from a jacket pocket, filled with a near-translucent purple solution. I should bring you back to Konoha, maybe study you to see exactly how you managed this. He frowned as he moved between the trees, the crackle of dimming flames receding behind him. But 1. Bringing a puppeteer into my workshop would be the height of idiocy. And 2. If this is the price of immortality, he regarded the lump of meat Sasori had been reduced to, I think I'd prefer to age with some dignity. So, I'm going to give you exactly the same chance you gave me. Poisoned, alone, miles from safety. He injected the quivering little core of flesh until there was nothing left in the syringe, now well outside the clearing. He paused, a good 100 feet from the nearest puppet body, broken or otherwise, and set Sasori down on the ground almost tenderly. Somehow, I doubt you'll fare as well. He turned, walking back towards the battlefield so that he could collect as much of the debris as he could before a passing patrol noticed. He had chosen this spot explicitly because it was usually left fairly secluded, but he didn't want to take any chances. Despite everything, there were still things he could learn from the missing Nin, even if it wasn't in the way his 8-year-old self had dreamed. Goodbye, Sasori. Water dripped slowly from a stalactite as the 8 flickering figures stood in tense silence, arrayed in a circle around an ornate oil lantern. Each one was nothing more than an oily silhouette, features shrouded by shapeless black cloaks adorned with faint red clouds. Only their eyes could be seen clearly, each pair shining as if lit from behind. Deidara, would you care to explain how this happened? The leader of the group asked, his voice the epitome of calm. Still, there was a steely compulsion underlaying the words that spoke of dire consequences for an unsatisfactory answer. You were aware of my instructions regarding that we each travel with our partners, yes. It's not my fault, one of the others shouted irritably, doing his best to meet the gaze of those gray, ringed eyes. Sasori Dana said that he would take care of it. It was just one brat. Some upstart puppeteer he said he had to put back in his place. How was I supposed to know that he would kill Sasori? Yeah. That upstart brat, another member intoned quietly, vibrant red eyes spinning slowly in the gloom, was the Kyubi Jinchuriki, and the first ninja to reverse engineer Suna's puppetry. Deidara sneered, well, last I checked, Itachi, the Kyubi brat is supposed to be yours and Kisam's concern, yeah. Whoa, the tallest silhouette called out, grinning to reveal his shark-like pointed teeth. Don't pull me into this. We were told to only monitor the brat, not make a move yet. It was your partner who went all gung-ho because he felt threatened by some kid. Sasori Dana didn't feel threatened, you damn sushi roll. Kisam's grin dipped slightly as his hand went for the bundle on his back. It seemed to chitter excitedly. You want to say that again when you're not separated from me by 2 countries. I'll show you exactly where you can stick those creepy mouths of yours, yeah. Before the former Iwanin could retort, Itachi cut in with his smooth, disarming tone. I'm surprised at your concern, Deidara. You and Sasori only ever seem to argue. I had thought you would be pleased that your brand of art emerged victorious. Deidara's sneer only deepened. You call that a victory? Sasori Dana and I might have had our artistic differences, but we could at least respect one another. I'm going to kill that little doll-playing bastard when I get my hands on him. The whole world will see the blast. You will do no such thing, their leader commanded, eyes narrowing. You have your targets, that remains unchanged. Deidara seemed ready to argue, but wilted under those implacable gray eyes. Ensuring the Iwa-Nuke Nin was properly chided, they turned back to Itachi. Still, this is an unacceptable loss for the Akatsuki. Sasori's network of informants proved incredibly useful, and no matter how much Setsu plugs the gaps, it will be impossible to salvage entirely. We will have to move up our schedule while our information is still good. That means everyone needs to focus on their higher priority targets. The 2 doujutsu users held each other's gaze for a few moments, before Kisame snorted, grinning. Geez, you could cut the tension in here with Shibuki, and that thing doesn't even have an edge. Must you make light of everything? The next tallest of the silhouettes growled, his eyes even more difficult to make out thanks to their unusually dark sclera. I could be out hunting bounties, instead, I'm wasting time with this pointless prattle. We all have our targets, so can we just get on with this? He glanced at his partner disdainfully. Don't look at me, I'd rather be anywhere but surrounded by a bunch of heathens like you. He was likely the plainest of the bunch, with slicked back hair and dark, dilated eyes. The sooner I can get out and back to celebrating Jashin Sama's glory, the better. The taller one grimaced. You're lucky I can't kill you. And you're blessed that I keep trying. His partner shot back, voice pitching slightly. Enough. The leader's voice cut through the argument like a knife, instantly bringing silence. You all have your assignments, I expect results soon, before any further setbacks can occur. Dismissed. One by one, the silhouettes began to wink out, darkening the cave further until only Pain and the strangest of the figures remained. What did you find, Zetsu? You're not going to like it, he replied in a sing-song, childish tone. He made for a strange sight, with one green eye, and another that was a solid yellow. Two large, plant-like protuberances grew from his shoulders, opening around his head like a Venus flytraps more. Most strangely, even through the oily sheen of the projection technique, it was apparent that his body was perfectly divided down the middle, between a white and a black half. We combed that entire field, but it seems the Kyuubi Jinchuriki made off with as much as he could carry, Sasori's body, his puppets, and the ring, he continued, this time in a low, dark tone that sounded decades older. Bit of a pack rat that won, huh? All we found was scraps, and Sasori himself, already dead. It was gross. Pain was silent for a moment, eyes narrowed. After Orochimaru's betrayal, the loss of another ring is unacceptable. If Itachi and Kisame fail to reclaim it along with the Kyuubi, do whatever you have to in order to retrieve it. Will do, boss, the white half called back, saluting sloppily. Understood. The black half growled a moment later, their projection flickering away. For a moment Pain was alone in the cavern, just a pair of grim, ringed eyes glowing in the dark, before those two vanished. Hanabi hummed as she poked at the lifeless wooden arm. I've heard of taking trophies from your defeated opponents. But isn't it a bit macabre to make trophies out of your opponents? It hadn't been that hard to put one of Sasori's bodies back together from amongst the various puppets Naruto had salvaged from the fight. The paranoid puppeteer had apparently hidden numerous copies of himself amongst the legion, not that they had done him much good in the end. From the abundance of spare limbs, even on the heavily damaged ones, putting one complete copy together hadn't been hard. He's not a trophy, Naruto muttered absently, examining one of the spare limbs he had collected. He was wary of touching the various human puppets Sasori had created over the decades, but the specially built bodies the puppeteer had made for himself were fair game. He's a study. You do well to be taking notes. Hanabi just grimaced as she deactivated her Byakugan. Yeah, most of this is completely over my head. How you're able to make heads or tails of these seals' designs is beyond me. Experience, the blonde replied. While the exact designs of the seals were foreign to him, it wasn't hard to make comparisons against his own work and extrapolate from there, slowly building up a base for Suna's Fuinjutsu and working out from that common ground. He didn't articulate any of this though, far too fascinated by the internal structure of Sasori's arm. While the older puppeteer had clearly never invested much energy into creating artificial chakra systems like Naruto, favoring human puppetry instead, he had clearly learned a lot from working with the human form. Naruto had dabbled in creating artificial musculature for his puppets, but had never been able to find quite the right materials to rival more robust, if limited, mechanisms. If he could work out how Sasori had managed to build up artificial muscles inside his hand-built puppets, then he was that much closer to the short-sighted boast he had made with Hinata. Could you be any more vague? Hanabi groused, taking a step back to get a good look at Sasori's body. The gaping compartment where the man's organic component had rested looked strangely empty, like it was just waiting to be filled. In fact, the whole thing was just an exercise in creepy. Who voluntarily turned themselves into a puppet. Be thankful I'm not the Hokage, Naruto countered with a grin, looking up from his examination. I swear, as a kid, he used to make a game of being as cryptic as possible. Hanabi gained a melancholic smile of her own. Yeah, some of the elders in the clan used to do the same things, although that might have just been how they were. I think the elderly try to go for an aura of mystique, because that's how their elders treated them, and they want some fun of their own. Convincing theory. It was a light comment, but the mention of her home seemed to have lowered the mood in the room. Naruto knew she was probably thinking about her decision again. Whether or not she made the right choice. He looked back to his work, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Sasori's decades of secrets weren't going to be unlocked overnight, and he still had the man's unique scroll storage systems and pressure jets to get through. Not to mention trying to work out how the man had managed to recreate the Kazekige's magnet release. Unpacking that alone was going to be weeks, if not months of work. At least he had the time now. It had been apparent, almost overnight, just who exactly had been pulling the specific strings behind this war escalation. Now that Sasori was dead, it was as though hundreds of people across the continent had woken up from a terrible nightmare. Even if he just took those who showed outward signs of Sasori's control, those that had clearly had to be influenced outside of their own morals, the extent of the man's network was terrifying. Already he had sent word for as many of his agents as possible to approach these sleepers, carefully of course, to offer help in adjusting and dealing with the things they suddenly remembered doing. If he could get even a handful on board, it would be an immense insight into Sasori's, and by extension, the Akatsuki's, dealings. He was under no illusions he was the only one, either. Moving around the other villages' spy networks without tipping his hand could grow tiring at times, but it was a very different kind of thrill than combat. For one, you could rarely see your opponent. With that in mind, it was no surprise that the war was once again beginning to wind down. Tsuna's 180 on the matter might have been comical, if not for the lives that would likely be ruined. The concessions forced from the already weakened village would essentially see them reduced to minor village status, a line they had been slowly trying to crawl away from since the disappearance of their sandaime. Kiri was a slightly different matter, as Yagura appeared willing to continue his self-destructive campaign, but it was mostly the same story. The people who allowed for that war were pulling out as fast as their dignity would allow. Soon, it would just be one man, and the shinobi he hadn't terrified into defecting, against Konoha. Still a force to be reckoned with, but that was what the rebellion was for. With Konoha helping him along, providing some legitimacy and logistics support, Mei Terumi would probably have the hat in less than a month. In all, it looked as though things were back on course to normalcy and peace, which troubled him immensely. Mostly because he still had no idea what the Akatsuki hoped to gain from all of this. His working theory was that it was a distraction. But for what? The names he had gotten out of Sasori were useful in gauging the strength of the small organization, but not for working out the goal. The news that somebody had killed and usurped Hanzo was perhaps the most troubling. He never had been able to get an agent into a megacore. But, again, it was a problem that wasn't going to solve itself anytime soon. He sighed, and glanced up, catching sight of Hanabi working on her puppet. She had managed to refine Mari quite a bit, allowing more of the feminine aspects shine through. Right now though, she was just checking and rechecking the various mechanisms in a lackluster manner. His fingers tapped against the desk restlessly. It had been a few days since he had gone out, he needed a break, and he probably wasn't the only one. How do you think you would look as a blonde? He asked out of the blue. The sky was alight with colors as firework after firework splashed the sky with vibrant reds, pinks, blue and whites. Hanabi might have thought it ironic that she had never actually seen a firework before tonight, considering her name, if she wasn't so captivated by the bright display. Her father would have been horrified to see her there, gawping up at the sky like a child, like a commoner. Such behavior was beneath a Hyuga. But tonight, she wasn't a Hyuga. In fact, with her cornflower blue contacts and platinum hair, she could have quite convincingly passed for a Yamanaka. She had been worried by that at first, but the dye didn't even tingle when she applied it. With a simple application of a counter solution, it would wash out easily. Without it, the color was effectively permanent. Shinobi had invested a lot into coming up with effective alternatives to the henge. She had thought the disguise a little unnecessary considering they weren't even in Konoha. Konoha didn't use fireworks in their festivals, but those kinds of thoughts were wiped away among the beautiful yukatas and exciting stalls. She drifted between them in a daze, indistinguishable from the mob of relaxed civilians enjoying their small celebration. Naruto had quietly advised her to purposefully fail at most of the stalls she visited. Shinobi skills sort of went against the spirit of the event, but she was otherwise free to roam and enjoy herself. Naruto himself stayed a few paces back, and at first glance most wouldn't have been able to tell they were together, save for the fact that he had dyed his own hair the same pale shade of blonde. Far from Hanabi's excited enthusiasm, he wasn't sure what to do with himself. He had to keep an eye on her of course, to make sure she didn't slip off or compromise her identity, but he had little interest in the various festival activities. He only got a small rush from purposefully lowering his skill just enough to win, without looking like it was easy. It got old quick, and he instead stuck to admiring the designs of the ornate clothing. He had been thinking about ways to incorporate entrancing patterns onto his puppets, the same way kunoichi occasionally used their outfits as distractions. It would detract from their shock value, but might up the creepiness when contrasted with their more plainly unnatural features. He could see it coming together in his head, especially when he admired some of the riskier kimono choices, but it wasn't quite there yet. He was trying to examine the way a girl around his age had done up her hair with chopsticks when he felt Hanabi's hand wrap around his own, tugging him towards a specific stall. When he glanced down, she wasn't even looking, he wasn't even sure she had noticed. She hadn't looked this happy since he had allowed her to start on larger puppets. He was glad she was at least enjoying herself. He had thought this might be a nice break for himself, but those same problems continued to swirl in his head. Puzzles wouldn't go away just because he wanted them to. They would keep scratching away in his mind, restless, waiting to be solved. When he solved them, others would take their place. There was always another problem to solve, another puppet to build, or improve. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all press on his shoulders. How long had he been doing this? How long would it continue? How had he never felt it all before? And then, like a breath of wind, Hanabi was there, smiling like the child she should have been, instead of the ninja to be Konoha would have made her, that he was making her. She was pointing to something, goldfish swimming in a tank that children were trying to scoop out with pathetic little rice paper discs. There was an innocence there. An innocence he had done his very best to stamp out. No. He closed his eyes a moment and breathed, feeling the world slow down again. Hanabi would have been a kunoichi regardless of what he did. He opened his eyes again, smiling now, and allowed himself to be led up to the tank. He paid the stall manager, a greasy-looking man that barely gave him a glance before handing over 3 little discs. He knew it was essentially a scam. The water would make the discs little better than tissue paper, but stall games weren't supposed to be winnable. There were probably a few sturdier discs hidden among the stacks, to keep it interesting. Hanabi tried it, not using chakra like he had asked, and the result was predictable. Even with her reflexes, there was only so much you could do with the materials at hand. Still, the frown she wore when the last disc broke stirred something in him. It was only worsened when the stall owner smirked at the pair. Nice try, little girl, you were close on that last one. Maybe your Nissan there will let you try again. The smooth delivery was familiar. As a kid, Naruto had practiced talking to himself over and over in front of a mirror until he could sound just like that. Inviting. Charismatic. Genuine. It sounded so saccharine now that he had peeked behind the curtain. The blonde, more tan than usual that night with the makeup that hid his whiskers, smirked right back. I'll do you one better. He paid again, but set the spare discs to the side. He turned the one in his hand over a few times before glancing down at the tank. He didn't use chakra, that would have been way too easy. Instead, he moved the scoop along the top of the water, never quite dipping it in, until it was hovering over a fish. With a quick flick of his wrist, the scoop bobbed down, caught the fish, and flicked it into the air. Right at the stall owner. The small crowd that had gathered got a good laugh from seeing him flail awkwardly as the fish slid into his shirt. Naruto used the chaos to pull a laughing Hanabi back and away from the stall, sporting a small grin himself. It had been a while since he'd done anything so juvenile. It was cathartic. Suddenly, instead of the next puppet design, or shadowy organizations, his mind was filled with the small, vindictive pleasure of seeing a crooked businessman get small taste of karma. And you were telling me not to draw too much attention, Hanabi snickered, having snagged a goldfish for herself in the confusion. She was picking up bad habits from him. He approved. Ninja are beholden to no rules. Not even our own, he replied in a heavily exaggerated sagely tone, earning another giggle that only made his own smile grow. Hanabi quietened after a moment, peering down at the goldfish in its little plastic bag. He reminds me of the koi back at the compound. Her eyes dipped. They were my mother's idea, something for the clan to nurture together. She thought it might begin to heal the fractures between our broken family. That's what Hinata said anyway. Nowadays, she's the only one that even tends to them. Father would rather forget anything that reminds him of mother, and the branch family only see it as another chore lumped on him by the main house. And despite all that, you still miss them, Naruto finished for her, good mood dissolving as quickly as those rice paper scoops. Every family has problems, but they're still family. Naruto shrugged. I wouldn't know. Hanabi glanced up at him, lips twisted to the side. I guess your puppets are the closest thing you have to a family, huh? She returned to examining her goldfish. That's actually kind of sad. Naruto's mouth twitched at that, but a sidelong look told him that she hadn't meant it as an insult. He closed his eyes and counted backwards from 10. He hadn't needed the Hokage's pity, and he didn't want Hanabi's. I've been thinking, he started, only to be immediately interrupted. Careful with that. She smirked, watching her little fish swim hypnotizing circles around its bag. Wars have been started for less. He clicked his tongue, but ignored the jab. She wasn't wrong. I've been thinking, it might be possible to bring you back to the village. Hanabi stilled for a moment, nearly tripping over her foot. She recovered admirably, plastering a lopsided grin on her disguised features. What? Were you planning on just leaving me here? Naruto stopped, frowning. By now they were at the far end of the festival where it was quieter. Most of the people had begun to drift the other way, where a play was about to be put on. I'm being serious. Are you? Hanabi shot back, heat rising in her voice. Because last time I checked, you said that it was a one-time deal. I made my choice. Was it all just pointless? Huh. Do you just like to mess with me? Is that it? I didn't know then what I know now, he responded calmly, letting her anger wash over him. It wasn't like he didn't deserve it. I'm just trying to make things right. Hanabi seemed ready to rip into him again, but stopped herself, searching his face with her eyes for even a hint of a deception. Her shoulders drooped and she tried for a weak grin. If this is a lie, or one of your games then, she chuckled, a noise so hollow it was almost painful to listen to, then you can bet when you next come home lethally poisoned, I sure as hell won't save you. Naruto wasn't sure if it was appropriate to match her humor, so just shrugged. Then I'll probably deserve it. What happened to the selfish, amoral mercenary? She snipped, unable to look up at him, afraid that if she did, he would be wearing that cocky smirk and it would all just be a joke. He's still there, he's just come to enjoy wearing the mask. She didn't seem sure what to do with that, eventually settling for ignoring him in favor of her fish. They moved farther from the bustle of the festival, towards the outskirts where little shrubs slowly gave way to the trees that Hai no Kuni was famous for. You could really do it then? She asked, quietly, when they were sure nobody could be listening in. I have a plan. It won't be easy, and it will involve a lot from you. But it should work. It's the timing that's delicate. Suddenly bringing Hanabi back could have dire consequences on the upcoming talks with Kumo. It would be the height of irony if he reignited the war by fixing the mistake that resulted from causing it in the first place. So, a little more complicated than just dropping me in front of a patrol? She asked, some mirth finally creeping back into her tone. A little, yeah. He gave her a wan smile which made her remember that she was supposed to be angry and look away. So, what brought this on? He put his hands up behind his head as they walked. Oh, you know, war's drawing to a close, Kumo's in a pretty bad state. Konoha's going to begin asking some difficult questions. Hanabi narrowed her eyes, glaring at him for a moment before scoffing. You know, for a really good liar, you can be a really bad liar. If that's all this was to you, a convenience, then you would have just killed me, dumped my body and been done with it. The blonde's eyebrow quirked bemusedly. I've been teaching you a little too well, haven't I? Don't flatter yourself, I'm just that good of a stew, she trailed off, noting how Naruto's expression had abruptly sobered. Pain burst from the ground in an instant, so fast she barely had time to cry out in surprise. She hadn't even noticed him manipulating her. The puppet scooped the girl up and immediately flew up and away, accelerating with speeds that had her eyes watering, back towards Konoha. Back on the ground, Naruto allowed himself a single look to make sure Hanabi had gotten away, before turning back to a random spot in the tree line. Told you he'd noticed us, a low voice joked as two figures stepped into the clearing, materializing as if from the shadows themselves. The taller one grinned a pointy smile at the blonde, inclining his head as he removed the wide-brimmed shugegasa. Sorry to interrupt your little date there, but you're a tough little shit to track down. I'll take that as a compliment, Naruto drawled, practically forcing his eyes not to flick up at the rapidly diminishing silhouette of Hanabi. He was under no illusions, ironic considering who he was staring down, that these two couldn't bring her back, even at this distance. His best bet was keeping them busy, it helped that they were clearly here for him. You should, Kisum grinned, only increasing his resemblance to a shark. You're going to have to come with us, Naruto, his partner finally spoke up. Naruto didn't fall into the trap of looking at him though, He knew that even a single glance at those spinning red eyes would ensnare him. Even looking at his feet was probably risky. Naruto knew enough about genjutsu that they weren't a mortal weakness, but definitely not enough to prepare him against someone like Uchiha Itachi. He should probably work on that. You know, revenge never really struck me as the Akatsuki's style, he commented dryly, pulsing his chakra at random in case he was already trapped in a genjutsu. As far as he could tell, he wasn't, but then, that was sort of the point of a genjutsu. You weren't supposed to notice. Bunch of S-class nuke nin. Must have taken something big to bring you all together without tearing each other apart. I guess you could say that, Kisame admitted with a smirk that found amusement in knowing something Naruto didn't. He supposed the attempt at fishing for information was a little obvious. But we're not here for Sasori. Creep was only good for his spies and a spar anyway. Now that was interesting. If the Akatsuki was here for him, irrelevant of Sasori, then that meant they were after something of his. The only thing interesting about him to shinobi like them was. His eyes narrowed, puzzle pieces snapping into place that refused to mesh before. The disappearance of Gaara, Yagura's crazed commitment to the war, rumors of the Nanabe Jinchuriki going AWOL. It felt like a stone had lodged in his gut. A group like the Akatsuki going after the Biju could mean nothing good. Criminals, with that kind of firepower, under a leader able to keep those kind of volatile personalities together. That spelled only disaster. The stone sank further, and some of his anxiety must have slipped past his mask. You've said too much, Kisame, Itachi intoned, voice never wavering beyond his bored monotone. What can I say? The piscine man replied, beady pin-pupiled eyes narrowing in on Naruto. It's not like it's going to matter much in a moment, is it? Itachi wasn't the kind of person who rolled their eyes or sighed in irritation. He just sent his partner a look, and the larger man quietened. That isn't Naruto. We haven't been talking to Naruto for a full minute now. Dami waved at them absently, dropping the act. Naruto had left along with Hanabi, disappearing down the hole Hane had made when she popped out of the ground. Only his limited ability to see through his puppet's eyes, although it only gave him fuzzy, black and white images, allowed him to keep up a convincing act as he raced away as fast as he could. Being prepared for Sasori was one thing. Taking on two Akatsuki members, alone. No chance. Wait, seriously? Kisame asked, grin slipping away. That's a puppet. His eyes narrowed in irritating. Bingo Book wasn't kidding, huh? Clearly, Itachi drawled, inwardly rather impressed. Naruto's substitution was flawless, using his own puppet as a screen in the split second it appeared. The intimate knowledge that implied, over his own body and his puppet's form, was remarkable. Although, whether he knew that his puppet's artificial chakra system would block his Sharingan's line of sight, or he had just guessed, remained to be seen. So how come your special eyes didn't notice, huh? The larger man asked, accusingly, hefting Samehada off his back and giving it a few test swings out of frustration. Pain wasn't going to be pleased. His puppets have chakra systems. They are rather convincing. I only noticed when he continued to resist my genjutsu. The puppets have chakra. Dami just waved again, still grinning impudently. Kisame took a lazy swipe at the construct and it jumped back. Okay, note to self, don't underestimate the guy who beat Sasori at his own game. Itachi gave his partner another suffering look. Quite. So, what now? You think we should take the puppet back to lead? Dami chose that moment blow up, scattering shrapnel and poison kunai in every direction. Not a single one managed to so much as graze either of the two S ranks, but the move still left Kisame's mouth twitching. I'm going to enjoy shaving that brat's fingers off, one by one. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.